So picture this. I'm in New Zealand. It's beautiful. But I'm 30 kilometres into an ultramarathon and I've been running for hours. And everything's going wrong. I can't keep food down. The humidity has rubbed my feet raw. And the pace I'd planned is gone. I'm walking into the aid station thinking, what now? I've been training for this race for over 12 months. So I'm thinking I can stop. No one would think less of me. The conditions have turned and withdrawing isn't failing. Or I can keep going. With no plan and 20 kilometres still ahead of me. This episode is about what happened next and what I've come to think it taught me about leadership. Welcome to The Threshold, where we say the quiet part of leadership out loud. A show about the space between who you were and who the role asks you to be. I'm Amanda Ramplin. In the last 4 episodes, we've been sitting with what happens at the threshold. The doorway moment, the trap of outworking it, the performance of having it together, and then the voice inside your head at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. Today, I want to take us in a slightly different direction. I want to tell you a story about something I went through that revealed something specific about leadership I hadn't fully understood before. The race itself was the Tarawera Ultra, and I was running the 50-kilometre distance through the forests around Rotorua on the North Island of New Zealand. Apart from UTA 50 in the Blue Mountains, it was the hardest thing I've ever done physically. And in the months afterwards, I kept noticing the lessons from that race kept arriving in the leadership work, not as analogies, but as recognitions. The capacity to stay with discomfort, the relationship with the voice that wants you to stop, the discipline of pace, and the moment when the conditions you trained for stop being the conditions you're in. All of these turned out to be central to leadership. So today I want to share what I learned. As observation from someone who spent a long day in the forest in New Zealand, finding out what was actually true about her own capacity. So let's go back to the morning of the race. The Tarawera Ultra runs through the forests around Rotorua on the North Island of New Zealand. The terrain is technical terrain with some elevation through some of the most beautiful country I've ever seen. The race I was running was the 50 kilometres. I'd been training for months, long runs on the trail near where I live, strength work, practicing my nutrition. I'd done everything you're meant to do, and I felt as prepared as I knew how to be. The race started in good weather, with the kind of nervous energy that all trail runs produce. If you've ever had a chance to experience this, you know how electric the vibe is. The first 30 kilometres went better than I expected. I was running well and my pace was good. The first major aid station came and went smoothly. I was eating, drinking, holding my form. I let myself think that this was going to be fine. It wasn't going to be fine. Somewhere between that aid station and the next, the day started to come apart. The first thing that happened was nutrition. I'd been eating the same nutrition I'd been practicing for months, so my body knew it. But something shifted. My stomach started rejecting what I was putting in. Everything made it worse. By the time I figured out what was happening, I was feeling genuinely unwell. The second was the humidity. The morning had started cool, but by mid-morning the humidity had risen. And I probably didn't expect New Zealand to be as warm as it was. My feet, which had been fine, started to develop blisters. Not the usual hot spots, but large, gnarly blisters on the balls of my feet. The third thing was the pace. With nutrition failing and the blisters forming, the pace I'd been holding became impossible. I had to slow down significantly, which meant my time targets, the one I had been quietly running toward in my head, were no longer achievable. The race I'd planned to run was over. What happened next was going to be a very different race. I I came into the aid station in a different state I'd been in the previous one, not feeling strong or capable at all. I was someone who was hurting, who couldn't reliably take in fuel, and who was on her feet by something that wasn't quite confidence anymore. And I had a choice to make. The choice was real, with my nutrition failing, the blisters worsening, and 20 kilometres still to run. Withdrawing was a reasonable thing to do. I could try again next time. I'd trained well. I'd done the work. The conditions had turned against me. Withdrawing wasn't failing. It was responding to what was actually happening. The other option was to keep going, without a plan for how, without a nutrition strategy that worked, with feet that were going to get far worse before they got better, and for another 20 kilometres on tired legs. I stood at that aid station for about 30 minutes, drinking water, trying to get something down. Bananas became my best friend. Listening to the voice in my head. The voice was talking, and it wasn't urging me to stop. It was being reasonable. It was pointing out accurately that conditions were now different, and it was noting that withdrawing would not be failure. It was reminding me that the body has limits, and the wise thing was to respect them. Everything the voice said was reasonable, but underneath it, something quieter was asking me a question. What would it cost you in the years ahead to know you stopped here? I got up, I left that aid station, and I started running again, slowly, with no real plan for what I was about to do. And here's what I want to say about the decision at that point to keep going. I didn't feel strong when I made that decision. I wasn't certain, and I didn't know whether my body could do it. The decision wasn't powered by confidence. It was powered by something underneath confidence. Something more like willingness. The willingness to keep going without knowing if I could. The next 20 kilometres were the hardest I've ever run. At times I had to walk, and I made every kind of bargain with myself about how I would manage the next 10 minutes, and then the next 10, and the 10 after that. But my body kept going, slowly, with a lot of internal commentary. The mind quietened eventually into a kind of negotiation that was just background noise. The blisters got worse, and then they kind of got bearable, because at some point a body running on adrenaline stops registering pain accurately. The lack of nutrition shifted a little when I realised I could hold down cola, so the flask I'd filled with electrolytes and water became bottles of Coke at every aid station. I crossed the finish line in about 2 hours slower than I'd planned, with feet that I feared removing from my shoes because I didn't want to see them, and with a body that was going to take weeks to recover. And I knew something I hadn't known before. What I knew was the version of me who stood at that aid station was the version of me who got to decide. And the version who decided to keep going was a different version than the one who'd started that race in the morning. The version of me hadn't existed yet at 6 a.m. She came into being at the aid station, in the decision to continue. I didn't know at that time that this would be the most important thing I learned that day. I wouldn't articulate it for months, but it's the lesson that's been most useful in my work as a coach. So let me try to name it now. Here's what the race taught me about endurance and about leadership. The first thing is that the plan and the conditions are different. You can train perfectly. You can do everything right. You can prepare in every way you know how to prepare, and the conditions on the day can still be different from the conditions you trained for. Humidity you didn't expect, nutrition that stops working, and a pace that's no longer possible. This isn't a failure of planning. It's just the nature of doing anything real. The plan is built on the best information you have. The conditions are what happens. They're always slightly different. I think this is exactly what's happening to many leaders at the threshold. You've trained for one set of conditions. You did the degree, you climbed the ladder, you developed the skills, you built the relationships, And the role you're in now has a different set of conditions than the role you trained for. Not because anyone misled you, but because conditions change. The work isn't to keep trying to make the trained skills fit the new conditions. The work is to become someone who can respond to the conditions that are actually present. The second insight is more about the body itself. There's a theory in exercise science called the central governor model. The basic idea is that the brain signals fatigue well before the body has actually reached its limit. The brain is protecting the body, but the body has more in it than the mind initially admits. I felt this directly at the aid station. My body wasn't done, but my mind had concluded the day was over. The voice was making a reasonable case, but the body, when asked to continue, was able to. Not gracefully, but able to. This isn't about pushing through pain. The central governor isn't there to be defeated. It's there to keep you safe. And there are moments when the body really does need to stop. The skill is to know the difference between the protective voice and the genuine limit. The same is true for leadership at the threshold. There's a voice that activates when the work gets hard. That voice has a job. It's trying to keep you safe. It's protecting you from depletion, from exposure, and from failure. But often, the voice activates before you've actually reached your limit. The voice is telling you to stop when you still have something in you. The capacity to recognize this voice and to hear it without immediately obeying it is one of the most useful things any leader can develop. It doesn't mean ignoring it. It means having a different relationship with it. The third one is harder to put in words, but I think it's the most important. It's about the relationship between willingness and capacity. I didn't feel strong when I made the decision to keep running. I wasn't sure I could finish. The decision was an expression of capacity. It was an expression of willingness. And here's what happened. The capacity came after the willingness, not before. My body had more in it than I thought, but only once I'd committed to using it. My mind quietened eventually, but only once I'd stopped negotiating with it. The version of me who could finish that race didn't exist when I was sitting at the aid station. She came into existence in the decision to continue. This was one of the most important things I've come to understand about leadership. We often wait to feel ready before we move. We wait for confidence. We wait for certainty. And we wait for the conditions to feel manageable. Waiting like this can keep us stuck. The capacity to lead through difficulty often arrives after the willingness to lead through difficulty, not before. The version of you who can hold this role hasn't fully arrived yet. She comes into being in the choosing. The fourth one is simpler, but I think it's genuinely useful, and it's about scale. You can't run 50 kilometres. It's not a thing you can do. Even the elite ultra runners who do it for a living aren't running 50 kilometres. They're running to the next aid station, and then to the next one, and then to the next one. 50 kilometres is what the cumulative running becomes. But what they're actually doing, moment to moment, is much smaller. The same is true in leadership. The work isn't to lead the whole year at once. The work is the next conversation, the next decision, the next week. The year, when you look back at it, is what those small moments add up to. I used this exact strategy in the second half of the race. I stopped thinking about the finish. I thought only about reaching the next aid station. And then, once there, the next one. The whole second half of the race was made up of moments where my only job was keep moving forward to the next thing. Leaders who are struggling often try to hold the whole transition in their heads. They want to know how the role will work out, how the team will respond, how the year will go. And the weight of that whole picture is what makes everything feel impossible. The work is much smaller. The next conversation, the next decision, the next week. So how do these insights actually land in the work of leading? A few things to take from this. First, name the conditions you didn't train for. If something feels harder than it should, if your usual approaches aren't working the way they used to, take a moment to recognize that the conditions might have changed. The work isn't the same work, even if the title is the same. The team isn't the same team, even if the people are mostly the same. Something has shifted. Naming this isn't a complaint. It's a recognition. It frees you from the assumption that your old approaches should still be working and opens the question of what the current conditions actually require. Second, distinguish the protective voice from the genuine limit. When the voice in your head says this is too hard, ask whether this is the protective voice doing its job or whether you've actually reached a limit that needs respecting. Both happen. Sometimes the answer is to stop. Sometimes the voice is activating before the limit. The way to know the difference, in my experience, is to test it. Continue, just a little, see what happens. If continuing reveals new capacity, the voice was protecting. If continuing reveals genuine collapse, you've hit a real limit. But you don't know until you test. Third, act before you feel ready. Don't wait for the confidence to arrive before you do the hard thing. The confidence often comes after. The version of you who can hold this conversation, this decision, this responsibility, doesn't fully exist yet. It'll come into being in the doing. This doesn't mean acting recklessly. It means recognizing that waiting for certainty when no certainty is available is its own form of being stuck. Sometimes the move is to begin, even imperfectly, and let the capacity catch up to the willingness. Fourth, reduce the scale. If it feels overwhelming, the answer is almost never to hold all of it at once. The answer is to find the next manageable thing, the next conversation, the next week. In my case, the next aid station. Holding the whole picture is a strategic move you make occasionally. It's not a daily practice. The daily practice is much smaller. What's the next thing? Just that. And then once done, the next thing after. That's how an ultramarathon gets run. It's also how leadership transition gets made. If you're at the threshold right now, here's the question I'd offer you. What conditions are you in that you didn't train for? Not what has gone wrong. What's different about the actual conditions you're leading in compared to the conditions you prepared for? And then a second question. What would it mean to act before you feel ready? Just for one specific decision. Just as an experiment. To begin, even imperfectly, and trust that the capacity might arrive in the doing. You don't need to answer that today. Just sit with it. This has been episode 5 of The Threshold. Next time, we'll talk about the seasons of self-trust. The way trusting yourself isn't a constant. It moves. There are seasons when it's high and seasons when it's almost completely gone. And the eroded version of self-trust often shows up in leadership behaviour that looks from the outside like insecurity, control, or refusal to delegate. I'll share a story about what that looks like and why most leaders carrying it can't see it in themselves. If this episode landed, the most helpful thing you can do is to share it with one person. Someone you know who's standing at a threshold of their own, trying to decide whether to keep going. Sometimes a story is what helps us recognize what's actually being asked. If you haven't already, follow the show wherever you're listening so the next episode finds you. And if you have time, leave a review. Your review genuinely helps other leaders find this work. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.